What's happening, folks? Back again for another edition of New Maroon Getaway podcast / vlog. Life examined by an aspiring 21st century Maroon. I'm actually back with another little segment a little sooner than I thought I would be, but I saw this series of articles online, which was published back in July, but I just happened to see them maybe 2 days ago, written by a journalist and an educator I've been following for on and off for a number of years. He has a organization called the Post-Carbon Institute, a guy named Richard Heinberg. So he writes a lot about energy and economy and ecological issues. When I first came across him, it was when I first started seeing writings about the issue of peak oil. So, the implications of oil depletion and how that would sort of influence future prospects for, life on the planet and future happenings in human history and all of that sort of thing. But just as a sort of a general topic, the sort of the history of history, the unfolding of history, patterns of history has really been something that I've been quite interested in. And it's funny because the whole idea of patterning comes out of my experience in undergoing, my permaculture training. Just that whole idea of pattern language and systems thinking, and how history kind of functions as a system, as a pattern phenomenon. So there are a number of books that I've been reading or picking through over the last few years. So one of them I mentioned the other day, which was this one. Let me just adjust. So, Against the Grain, Deep History of the Earliest States, which is really again an examination of history through the eyes of agriculture. The idea that, not the idea that apparently agriculture was not necessary in order for human beings to live lives as sedentary communities. That actually agriculture had arisen or facilitated the founding or the establishment of states. And there's a whole discussion that we're likely to have about that, because there's a great deal in that book that I think is really important. But also this book, Collapse: How Societies Choose to Fail to Succeed. Excellent, excellent text. Again, covering the general topic of how human societies have not only risen, but how they've failed. Probably most importantly, how they failed. Understanding whether or not there happens to be some discernible pattern, behind that phenomenon. Before that book, same author, Jared Diamond. This was a book written in the mid-'90s called Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fate of Human Societies. Again, excellent book, which was written about a decade before the Collapse book was released. Then there's The Great Leveler by Walter Scheidel. Violence and the History of Inequality, from the Stone Age to the 21st century. All of these books are, again, looking at patterns that one would be able to decipher if you look at history with a kind of wide enough or broad enough lens. So when I saw this three-part series from Richard Heinberg, again, I thought this was fit right into that same lane, that same vein of looking at patterns in human history, patterns of human behavior, and in this instance, trying to draw a parallel between the patterns not only that have marked human behavior in human history, but also how ecosystems work, how nature functions. And I think this is a kind of a worthwhile analogy to look at in greater depth. So I wanted to start picking through this piece and then maybe just have like kind of a running commentary or point out a number of things that he's written here. So it's this is we'll just go through this gradually. So it's titled "Human Predators, Human Prey: Society as Ecosystem in a Time of Collapse." I think already the title is pretty. It grabs you. I think the analogy of the predator-prey relationship that one sees in ecosystems, the idea that you see a similar relationship in how human beings, human relations function is already it's already quite fascinating. So just to start, reading through the piece, he says in the introduction, a lion runs down a gazelle. A raiding band brandishing clubs, bows, and arrows descends on a tribal village. A loan shark confronts a delinquent borrower. In each of these three scenarios, one party seeks to gain at the expense of the other. Without a moment's hesitation, we classify the first interaction between the lion and gazelle as a predator-prey relationship. Biologists and ecologists have studied such relationships in detail for many decades, codifying principles that help us understand and predict the behavior of entire ecosystems. Could we use predator-prey relationships among widely divergent species in nature as a metaphor to help in understanding the behavior of people in complex human societies, in which some people gain at the expense of others? Even the best metaphors have limited usefulness, and this one certainly has potential for misapplication. However, as I hope to show, it also has the ability to illuminate. Now, I think even given the theme or the title of my podcast, New Maroon Getaway, this most definitely ties in with this theme, where the maroon, the runaway slave, is attempting to get away from again from this predatory relationship that the one that has held them in bondage. He's attempting to try to come out from underneath the hold or being taken advantage of by someone who would be seen as a predator, or by people that would be seen as a predator. And actually, he mentions this in the second part of the essay. So, just to continue, a complex or stratified human society can be thought of as an ecosystem. Within it, humans, all a single species, because of their differing social classes, roles, and occupations, can act in effect as different species. To the extent that some exploit others, we could say that some act as predators and others as prey. There may even be human analogs to subcategories of predatory behavior such as parasitism and infection. Within non-human species in nature, forms of competition or exploitation unquestionably exist. For example, when a shoebill gives birth to two chicks, the mother and father tend to favor one of them. Then the favored offspring attacks the unfavored, which inevitably dies. Bull elk battle one another for mating privileges, sometimes to the death. but the extent and variety of human ways of exploiting other humans defy comparison with the behavior of any other animal. Hence the predation metaphor. Human groups have preyed upon one another via two main pathways, intragroup and intergroup, which have often intersected or run parallel. Members of a complex society can prey upon other members of the same society via slavery, which including sex slavery and debt slavery, caste, class, taxes, rents, crime, and debt. On the other hand, one society can prey upon a different society through raid, invasion, plunder, conquest, colonization, or, again, debt. In addition, members of conquered prey societies can be enslaved by or absorbed into the predator society, becoming a permanent underclass. Speaking informally of human economic exploitation of other humans in terms of predation is hardly new, as we will see. However, a cursory search of the literature turned up few systematic explorations of the metaphor. In discussing the phenomenon of predation, I'm not so much interested in cases in which some humans actually eat others, though this did happen in some societies, but rather in forms of economic exploitation. In order to emphasize the metaphoric nature of this usage, I'll use quotation marks in every instance which terms like predator or prey are being applied to relations among and between humans. My main objective here is to use the predator-prey frame to see whether we can gain some insight into society, especially in its current context. This is not a static context. Instead, it is a highly dynamic and perilous situation dominated by our society's collision with ecological limits to further growth, including climate change, resource depletion, and species extinctions. We urgently need to understand this context better so as to predict, or at least in broad strokes, where our social ecosystem, quote unquote, may be headed. To change course in instances where there is still time to avert severe harm and to better adapt to whatever impacts are already inevitable. The basic premise of the whole idea behind New Maroon Getaway is to sort of imagine what marriage in this current context that he's speaking of, against this backdrop, what would marriage look like, given the crises and the considerably more complex world that we live in at the moment. So. This is definitely a worthwhile conversation to have. So he continues. Of course, all metaphors have limited usefulness. A metaphor that classifies human beings in terms of behaviors similar to those of other animals must come with special caveats. Here are 7 that I can think of. 1. Seeing human social roles in terms of predator-prey relationships, quote unquote, should not be interpreted as assigning superiority or inferiority. In nature, one can't say that any species is superior or inferior to another on the basis of its ecological function. Hares are as important to the web of life as foxes. For those that don't know, hares are basically like the rabbits. But just like, anyway, you can look it up. Nevertheless, as we'll see in a later section of this essay, some predator, quote unquote, humans have created belief systems, notably racism, as he says here, based on the notion of superiority in order to support and maintain exploitative relationships. These belief systems have no objective basis other than their functional usefulness to predators. In fact, seeing these belief systems for what they are, efforts to justify exploitation, is an essential way to reduce their power. So, for example, just to actually mention another book where this is examined really powerfully, is a book written by Khalil Gibran Muhammad, who I believe is teaching at Harvard right now, at the Kennedy, I think it was the Kennedy School of Government. I think that's the name of it. This is the Condemnation of Blackness, Race, Crime, and the Making of Modern Urban America. This is an amazing book because he's able to document or trace how crime statistics were in America were first racialized, and then secondly, how this racialization of crime statistics was used to justify basically excluding certain groups of people from public life, from civil life in America, most notably black people. So, for example, he actually shows how when European immigrants, kind of poor European peasants, were first coming to America, they had all of the same pathologies that are assigned almost exclusively or predominantly to black people in America. And when I say black people, I mean descendants of slaves. But he notes that the early sociologists of the time, in particular a guy named Frederick Hoffman, had actually stated that the reason for the social pathologies among them would be, again, sort of your violent crime, theft, public intoxication, and suicide. Interestingly enough, he looked at the problems among this that he saw among this population, and he actually, along with a number of others, had said that this was actually due to some societal dysfunction, that their pathology was a function of societal dysfunction. Whereas when the same pathologies were exhibited by black people, these were seen as being somehow endemic or endogenous to the group. They were ontologically pathological, if you will. That it was not an indication that something was wrong with the society, or there had been this protracted mistreatment and degradation of the group, that somehow this was something that was endemic to them. So, and then of course this was used as a as a means or a reason, a justification to deny them things that everybody else had simply been given as a function of their being seen as citizens. So, it's interesting that this was something that he points out early on. I highly recommend picking that book up, by the way, if you've never seen it. So it comes to the second point here. As human bystanders, we may admire an animal predator such as a wolf, and may sympathize with a prey animal such as a deer. But taking a larger and more dispassionate view, i.e. the view of a biologist, we understand that both wolf and deer are integral to the balanced working of the larger ecosystem. In human society, however, that neutral stance must inevitably confront morality. That's because predator-prey relationships, quote unquote, among humans are, again, not biologically based. They are socially constructed. It's an important point. Therefore, they are inevitably and always have been subject to negotiation, moral judgment, resistance, and rebellion. Marriage. 3. Human society currently is so complex that it may be hard to know who is predator, quote unquote, and who is prey, quote unquote, in any given situation. In all likelihood, most people simultaneously serve both functions in different aspects of their lives. Rather than attempting to throw specific people, groups, or occupations into mental bins, it is more useful for our purposes here to Identify general systemic means of exploitation. Who profits from whom and how? 4. All differences in roles and power among humans may not be reducible metaphorically to win-lose predation, quote unquote. Among animals, there are many species in which individuals assume differing social roles. In a wolf pack, roles range from the alpha, the dominant leader, through the beta, celsa, delta, gamma, and so on, down to omega wolves, those who are troublesome and show little respect, and are in effect social outcasts. The predator-prey, quote-unquote, metaphor does little to elucidate the nature of such social roles. Even more rigid hierarchies exist among the social insects, primarily termites, ants, and bees, which have used social complexity as a spectacularly successful strategy for increasing overall competitive success vis-a-vis other species. It is therefore likely that at least some human behaviors that appear predatory, quote unquote, have evolved to the advantage of the entire species. We will revisit this point repeatedly. So let's see what we got here. Open a window. Right, okay. 5. Relatedly, some readers might object to the metaphor of predation, quote unquote, because it is inherently violent. Red in tooth and claw, quote unquote, to use Tennyson, while human society is for the most part based on cooperation and collaboration. An alternative metaphor might be just as useful. The human body with its organs and functions, brain, heart, skin, etc. Right? This cooperative metaphor in which each part benefits by being integral to a larger whole is a helpful counterbalance to the predator-prey metaphor, which is inherently conflict-based. I've used this metaphor. I use this metaphor all the time in talking about how ecologies work in my classes. Where basically, ecologies or landscapes are like is like a terrestrial body. All of the parts of this ecological infrastructure, it all works, functionally speaking, for the benefit of the whole. What may at first appear to be competition, when you're looking at maybe a couple of discrete parts or two, discrete or separate components, might in fact be actually a cooperative relationship when you basically zoom out far enough to take a look at how the entire ecological assembly functions. So similarly, he's likening this to the functioning of how human society could be seen as working. 6. Apart from these caveats, there is the need for some clarification of how we'll use the metaphor and how we won't. While the term sexual predator, quote unquote, is in common usage, the very real phenomenon of sexual predation, quote unquote, is only tangential to our subject matter, i.e., economic exploitation. Also, warfare is an obvious and important subject area in which the application of the predator-prey, quote unquote, metaphor might yield insights. However, a full treatment of either sexual predation or warfare, again, predation, quote unquote, or warfare, would make this already long essay ungainly. I'll touch upon both subjects briefly as needed. 7. It is important to acknowledge that humans have been predators or scavengers throughout our evolutionary history, and that we are animals that eat other animals. We are, in fact, omnivores, right? And he talks about this further down in the piece. But as we humans have come to harvest more and more of Earth's productivity, we have become, in effect, super predators, quote unquote. We'll seek to gain some insight into how and why that has happened in, there's another section of the essay that he's going to talk about this. He continues, that's a lot of hedging. Forgive me, it really is required. Metaphors are powerful. They can help us think, but they can also prevent us from thinking. My purpose in this essay is to stretch our understanding, not to corral us into a mental cul-de-sac. Therefore, it's important to assess where and how the metaphor brings light and understanding and where it doesn't. With so many potential pitfalls, why use the metaphor at all? We think in metaphors, always have, always will. Society is a system, so we need to use systems thinking to understand it. And again, another great phrase that is used quite often in the work that I do. Perhaps the most studied example of a system is the ecosystem, and ecosystems are characterized by predator-prey relationships. At the same time, society is rife with exploitative relationships and behaviors that are frequently characterized as predatory. It all adds up to a compelling line of inquiry. So even though there may be snags along the way, let's see if we can use these observations metaphorically to probe human society at this time of great peril in order to gain some relevant insights. So he comes to the second section of the essay, and this one's titled Predator-Prey Relationships in Nature. So predator-prey relationships are the result of hundreds of millions of years of evolution and form the warp and weft of the food web. Predators often evolve to have sharp teeth and talons, while prey species typically evolve features and behaviors that enable them to hide or to escape or hide. The details of adaptation and specialization are wondrous and multitudinous. These relationships are an important means by which energy moves through the biosphere. The food web has three main elements. And this is hilarious because I talk about this all the time. Predators or autotrophs, which would include plants and algae, are organisms that use energy from sunlight along with elements from air, soil, rain, or ocean to build their energy storing tissues. And when we say energy, if we use the common definition that you'll hear in your, it's like a basic physics course, energy is just the ability to do work. It's your ability to actually do things, right? And so energy is what that is how it is basically defined. Secondly, the category of consumers or heterotrophs, organisms that consume other organisms, consists of animals that eat primary producers called herbivores, and animals that eat other animals called carnivores, and animals that eat both plants and other animals called omnivores, which is what we are. And you have decomposers, also called detritivores. They break down dead plant and animal materials and wastes and release them as energy and nutrients into the ecosystem for recycling. The category of consumers splits further into secondary and tertiary consumers, i.e. carnivores that eat other carnivores, such as seals that eat penguins, or snakes that eat frogs, that eat insects, that eat other insects. These are the trophic levels, or again, he's describing what's called the trophic cascade, by which energy moves through an ecosystem. At each stage, most energy and materials are lost as heat and waste, rather than being converted into work or tissues. That's why a typical terrestrial ecosystem can support only one carnivore to 10 or more herbivores of similar body mass, one secondary carnivore to every 10 or more primary carnivores, and so on. It's almost like logarithmic for you math people. Most ocean ecosystems are characterized by an inverted food pyramid in which consumers outweigh producers. This happens because primary producers have a rapid turnover of biomass on the order of days, while consumers' biomass turns over much more slowly, a few years in the case of many fish species. If energy is a main driver of the ecosystem, it is also a main limit, along with water and nutrients. Predators keep the population levels of prey species in check, but a decline in the population of prey species due to any cause, including overpredation, can lead to a fall in the population of predators. Typically, the abundance of prey and predators is characterized by cycles, with the population peaks of predators often lagging those of prey. So here it says, let's focus on one example. The field mouse, or vole. Its numbers in any given area vary according to the relative abundance of its food, typically small plants, which in turn depends on climate and weather. The local vole population's size often also depends on the numbers of its predators, which include foxes, raccoons, hawks, and snakes. A wet year can result in heavy plant growth, which temporarily increases the land's carrying capacity for voles, allowing the vole population to grow. And this growth trend is likely to overshoot the vole population level that can be sustained in succeeding years of normal rainfall. This eventually leads to a partial die-off of voles. Meanwhile, during the period that the population of voles is larger, the population of predators, say foxes, for example, increases to take advantage of this expanded food source and improve their odds of surviving, successfully reproducing, and raising kits. Kits are little foxes. But voles start to disappear. The increased population of predators can no longer be supported, and over time, the population of voles and foxes can be described in terms of overshoot and die-off cycles. Again, tied to external factors like longer-term patterns of rainfall and temperature. Using tools, language, and agriculture, early humans gradually found ways to overcome several key natural checks and balances. With our weapons, we can kill off our predators like lions and tigers. Now, the only large-bodied direct challengers we had to worry about were the humans. We could expand into new territories. We could adapt to using new and different resources. As a result, the total human population tended to grow slowly over thousands of years with occasional setbacks. Still, there were limiting factors, one of which was energy. There you go, that word again. As long as we depended on firewood for fuel, our numbers were partly limited by availability of trees. Ancient civilizations consumed forest after forest. Indeed, one of the oldest known human stories, the Epic of Gilgamesh, revolves around the hero chopping down trees, and the resulting deforestation was sometimes associated with the decline of civilizations. As a matter of fact, that is precisely one of the main causes of civilizational collapse that's mentioned by Diamond in his book. If you go in and either read the book or able to see a summary of the book, he names 8 causes of civilizational collapse, historically speaking, and then he names of 4 future likely causes for civilizational collapse. But the top 3 he names are deforestation and habitat destruction, as mentioned here, and then he mentions soil problems, which would include soil erosion and salinization, which is salting of soils, and the loss of fertility, and then the last one is water problems, water management problems. When you look at this stuff and you start to connect the dots, you realize that these aren't 3 separate problems, that they're all actually the same problem, or one is the logical outcome of the problem that preceded it. So again, this is all kind of embedded in what he's in what Heinberg's talking about here. So he says here, but in the last few centuries, and especially the last decades, fossil fuels began to substitute for firewood. This substitution enabled a massive increase in the global human population. And again, this will be, he's about to discuss this in the upcoming section. So here he has predator-prey relationships make ecosystems dynamic and complex. Efforts to understand that dynamism and complexity have led to the development of resilient science and to a key concept known as the adaptive cycle. This describes the cycle of resource organization, growth or exploitation, conservation, and release that ecosystems have been observed to follow. For example, in a ponderosa pine forest, the collective behavior of plants and animals organizes itself in a predictable pattern. First, following a disturbance, hardly an adaptable pioneer species, quote unquote, of plants and small animals fill in open niches and reproduce rapidly. Over time, those species that can take advantage of relationships with other species start to dominate. These relationships make the system more stable, but at the expense of diversity. Resources like nutrients, water, and light are so taken up by the dominant species that the system as a whole loses its flexibility to deal with changing conditions. Finally, these trends accumulate to make the system susceptible to a crash, say a wildfire. Many trees die, releasing their nutrients, opening the forest canopy to let more light in, and providing habitat for shrubs and small animals, and the cycle starts over. Some resilient scientists have observed that the adaptive cycle also characterizes the evolution of human societies, which likewise go through periods of growth, conservation, release, and reorganization. Ancient China, for example, saw several such cycles. Throughout the remainder of this essay, I will be discussing the adaptive cycle primarily as it relates to human society, and especially to the current crisis of global industrial society. I'm running out of memory. So actually, I think I have enough to finish. I'll finish this. So section 3. The origin and development of the human predator-prey relationship. The exact process that led to social stratification, class-based variance in social power and wealth, and complexity, a term that reflects the number and variety of technologies, social roles, and institutions in a society, is still unclear after decades of research by historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists. However, some general features of this evolutionary pathway have been clear at least since the 1960s. For tens of thousands of years, all humans subsisted by hunting and gathering, which again, this is something that is covered here. It talks about that in the beginning of the book. People usually lived in small groups, most of which were nomadic. Though in particularly abundant regions, it was possible for settlements to persist in place. Some of these settlements were ceremonial or trading centers. Authority within groups was mostly situational, based on demonstrated knowledge and skill. Anyone who felt oppressed could, in principle, at least simply leave. Under harsh natural conditions, some groups raided other groups' stores of food, often wounding or killing fellow humans in the process, occasionally taking captives. Revenge raids or killings would often follow. Archaeological research has shown that levels of interpersonal violence among hunter-gatherers varied greatly, but were generally very high. Simple horticultural, i.e. gardening societies emerged as animals and plants began to be domesticated, though a large proportion of calories still came from hunting and gathering. Domestication is actually a big part of Scott's book, and he talks about this as being sort of the precursor or one of the necessary steps in order for agriculture even to have emerged. So he talks about what he calls the 4 domestications. He talks about the domestication of plants, animals, fire, and humans. And I've said that I would also probably include the domestication of water as well. That I think that's another one that could have been included in the mix. Is the ability to be able to refashion or reshape landscapes to be able to take advantage of whatever available water there was. So that's another big one. So he says, continuing, these societies tended to establish temporary villages, and political organization often featured a big man, quote unquote, who gained influence and prestige through demonstrations of generosity and redistribution, but who exerted no coercive authority. Complex horticultural societies established stationary towns, a few of which were large enough to be called cities. Some production was for exchange, and trade expanded. These societies were organized around chiefs who were hereditary and enjoyed privilege as well as influence and prestige. Among some groups, warfare became highly ritualized and valorized. Pastoral or herding societies tended to exist in marginal environments such as deserts. Their subsistence revolved around the keeping of domesticated grazing, ruminant animals, including cattle, goats, sheep, and members of the camel family. These pastoral societies, while usually migratory, again featured hereditary chiefs, were highly patriarchal, and often inclined toward warfare as a cultural organizing principle. The advent of agricultural societies, defined by the growing of field crops, eventually brought cities and full-time division of labor. Societies became much larger, each identifying itself with a specific geographic region over which the state claimed ownership. Social stratification also appeared, sometimes in the form of a rigid intergenerational caste system, echoing the trophic levels of natural ecosystems. The peasant producer, quote unquote, class was far more numerous than the ruling or elite class. Soon there were also full-time soldiers, artisans, artists, merchants, moneylenders, and so on. Money, law, prisons, standing armies, and writing all appeared at this stage. This is something that actually Diamond talks about, how what we commonly associate with history, or sort of the unfolding of history, is intimately tied to the development of agriculture, because agriculture allowed for the establishment of states. And again, this is what Scott talks about, is that states arose with the development of agriculture and all of the domestications that made agriculture possible. And then this is where all of the things that we assume or kind of take to be the normal trappings of our lives, this is when it all starts. So it's really fascinating to be able to step through the process by which all of these things begin to come together. Where did I leave off? Okay, here we go. At the head of the state was a divine king, whose family shared in this coercive authority as well as his privilege and prestige. This is the point at which predation, quote unquote, within human society, not just between societies, appears to have become institutionalized. At the same time, however, levels of interpersonal violence, excluding warfare, i.e. intergroup violence, declined significantly. So again, that's an interesting point. In some instances, an agricultural society appears to have been conquered and dominated by a smaller but highly aggressive pastoral group, whose hereditary rulers then pursued the project of wider conquest. This appears to have been the case in ancient and medieval China, for example, though there were also instances where expanding agricultural states appear to have preyed, quote unquote, upon peripheral pastoralists. Actually, this is something that Ibn Khaldun talks about in the Muqaddimah, which again is seen as being the first book, one of the first books, if not the first book of kind of one of the first historical surveys. The result then was the establishment of an empire, with a central state systematically siphoning wealth from the peripheral colonies. Often people from conquered lands were imported to the capital as slaves, right? So again, in this instance, what does slavery represent? And I've written pieces about this, kind of trying to look at slavery from a systems thinking point of view. Slaves were simply the oil before oil, right? So they were the energy source before the advent of fossil fuel being able to be converted into work that was performed by machines. Right. So again, the human chattel was the oil before oil. This explains why, if you go in and you look at, there's another great book by Edward Baptiste called I think the half never told, which is basically, it's an account of how slavery provided the basis for the emergence of American capitalism, or capitalism generally speaking. That's actually, there's another book that talks about the beginning of thinking of human beings as consumers. That also talks about the role that slavery plays in the establishment of that system. I think that the title of the book is The Empire of Things, where in apparently according to the author, that slavery actually represented or provided probably the most perfect consumer good, or sort of or the basis for exchange of goods and the development of capital of any product in human history. At the inception of the Civil War, the American Civil War, slaves represented the most valuable class of assets in the American economy. Actually, by themselves, they were worth more than all of the other asset sectors combined. So that would have included the railroads, the banks, all of these asset classes. So again, very, very interesting to position this in the confines of history overall. So this simple schema runs the risk of oversimplification. Indeed, recent research has uncovered surprising exceptions at each stage along the way, including hunters and gatherers who were mostly sedentary and early cities that were egalitarian and showed no evidence of stratification. The path of social complexification and stratification often meandered and doubled back. Nevertheless, the essential trend persisted. As people organized themselves within ever larger groups and exploited their environments more systematically, coercive authority tended to appear. Whether in Central America, Europe, North Africa, South Asia, or East Asia, a relatively small elite group took charge and gained wealth and power. The masses, meanwhile, were held in a condition of relative poverty, their labor organized and controlled by overlords. At this time, the most advanced, quote-unquote, societies grew in complexity, power, and sophistication. Among social scientists, there have been two schools of thought with regard to the origin of stratification and complexity. Joseph Tainter in the Collapse of Complex Societies, another text, you can actually find that online as a PDF, summarizes these schools of thought clearly. Conflict theory, writes Tainter, asserts that the state emerged out of the needs and desires of individuals and subgroups of a society. The state, in this view, is based on divided interests, on domination and exploitation, on coercion, and is primarily a stage for power struggles. Karl Marx and his followers were prominent exponents of conflict theory. In contrast, again quoting Tainter, integrationist theories suggest that complexity, stratification, and the state arose not out of the ambitions of individuals or subgroups, but out of the needs of society. Even some apparent instances of domination and exploitation, in this view, may have emerged because there was a common advantage to such arrangements. Tainter, who regards the development of complexity as a problem-solving strategy adopted by society as a whole, suggests that a synthesis of conflict and integrationist views is needed, but leans toward the integrationist position. The most interesting recent work related to this question has come from cultural evolution theorists such as Peter Turchin, who suggests that near constant warfare was the mechanism that led from one stage of social organization to the next. Very interesting. The subtitle of Turchin's 2016 book, Ultra Society, How 10,000 Years of War Made Humans the Greatest Cooperators on Earth, encapsulates his thesis. In essence, he persuasively argues that internal complexity based on cooperation enables societies to compete more effectively with one another under conditions of frequent bloody conflict. In developing the predation metaphor, I have so far compared human society to a wild ecosystem. However, once humans had left hunting and gathering behind, they no longer inhabited an entirely wild ecosystem. Increasingly, they were domesticating plants and animals and altering landscapes to support domesticated species. This behavior may have shed some light on the evolution of relations between humans, who were, in effect, also domesticating, quote unquote, themselves in one another. Like that term, that idea of domesticating people, I think is really quite powerful. Wikipedia defines domestication as a, quote, sustained multi-generational relationship in which one group of organisms assumes a significant degree of influence over the reproduction and care of another group to secure a more predictable supply of resources from that second group. Unquote. Domesticated non-human species can be said to have benefited from the relationship. By giving up freedom, they gained protection, a stable source of food, and the opportunity to spread their population through a wider geographic range. As Michael Pollan discusses in his popular book, The Botany of Desire, A Plant's Eye View of the World. As we'll see, the same benefits accrued to humans themselves as they became more domesticated, quote unquote. We'll break that down further. Right. Several authors seem independently to have come upon an insight that's key to our present discussion: the human domestication of prey animals. Effectively, a predator-organized system for the management of prey may have served as a template that could be transferred to intra-human relations. Humans domesticating an animal species must have had to organize their own thinking and behavior in order to tame, feed, and selectively breed their animal captives. Once we domesticated prey animals, did we replicate that thinking and those behaviors within human society? This is very interesting. Domestication began before or concurrent with the development of stratification and complexity, not after it, though the process has continued to the present. Thus, it is extremely unlikely that human slavery served as a model or inspiration for animal domestication. However, the reverse is entirely possible. A test of this hypothesis might be to examine parts of the world that didn't have cattle, pigs, and horses and inquire if slavery still occurred in those places. However, candidate areas are problematic. Hunter-gatherer societies, for example, Aboriginal Australians, typically had no domesticated animals other than the dog, and no slavery or other systems of intra-societal exploitation. However, inter-societal raids were frequent, and captives were sometimes taken. In the case of pre-Columbian America, domesticated animals consisted primarily of dogs and turkeys in North America, and guinea pigs, llamas, and alpacas in South America. Slavery was institutionalized among at least some indigenous peoples of the Americas. Many groups enslaved war captives who were used for small-scale labor. Some captives were ritually sacrificed in ceremonies that sometimes involve ritual torture and cannibalism. Many groups permitted captives to gradually become integrated into the tribe. Slaves were not bought and sold, but could be traded or exchanged with other tribes. The hypothesis appears difficult to test in this way, but indirect evidence supports it, echoing the earlier work of ecologist Paul Shepard, anthropologist Tim Ingold at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, in his book, The Perception of the Environment, published in the year 2000, argues that foraging peoples regarded animals as their equals, while pastoralists tended to treat their domesticated animals as property to be mastered and controlled. Archaeologist Guillermo Alguez at the University of California in San Diego finds that the first city-states in Mesopotamia were built on the principle of transferring methods of control from animals to fellow humans. Scribes employed the same categories to describe captives and temple workers as they used to count state-owned cattle, which were among the first forms of property and money. Hunter-gatherers were typically difficult to domesticate, often preferring death to slavery, as Stanley Diamond and others have discussed. At the other end of the spectrum are modern citizens exposed in childhood to universal compulsory education. You should read my man John Taylor Gatto. We'll break that down thoroughly. So at the other end of the spectrum are modern citizens exposed in childhood to universal compulsory education, which, with its bells, routines, inculcation of behavioral norms, segregation of children by age, and ranking by achievement, results in adults prepared for life in an orderly, stratified, scheduled, and routinized society. And what's funny is he actually hyperlinks to Gatto's book, The Underground History of American Schooling, which is a monster of a book, or The Underground History of American Education. Monster book. Predation could be said to foster its own psychology. Predators, non-human and human, do not appear to view their prey with much compassion. Predation is a game to be played and enjoyed. If orcas and cougars could speak, they might echo the typical words of the professional bill collector. It's nothing personal, it's just business. The psychology of domestication follows suit. Sheep, cattle, pigs, and poultry are often regarded simply as commodities, rather than as conscious beings with intention, imagination, and feeling. For a family living on a farm, daily proximity with livestock entails getting to know individual animals, a few of which may earn sympathy and respect, especially from children. Many keepers of livestock generally care for their animals, treating them when they are sick, and making sure that when the animals are finally killed for food, the killing occurs with minimal pain and suffering. But when any animal comes to be seen as food, empathy is often attenuated, as it is in many slaughterhouses and fishing trawlers. Evidently, domestication wasn't always motivated by the desire for food. Some domesticates became workers. For example, horses, oxen, mules, or pets. The latter provided affection, companionship, amusement, and beauty. In class-based societies, rulers similarly exploit worker humans and develop close relationships with, and this is, when I read this, because I've been thinking about this so much as of late. So let me start again. In class-based societies, rulers similarly exploit worker humans and develop close relationships with quote-unquote pet artists, musicians, and other creative people, as well as concubines and sex slaves, who likewise supply companionship, beauty, and amusement. Today, many people lavish extraordinary care on their pets, as ancient Egyptians did with their cats, while society heaps attention and riches on elite musicians, actors, artists, athletes, models, and authors. The fact that the pet analogy has been poking me in the head for a long time. And the fact that he pointed this out, there's so much that he mentioned in this that has been turning over in my mind. So reading this is actually a real pleasure. Are human predator-prey relationships, quote unquote, as essential to complex human society as animal predator-prey relationships are to healthy ecosystems? Political idealists have replied with a resounding no. though the evidence is somewhat debatable. Cooperative complex institutions such as cooperative businesses are numerous and successful. Further, some industrial societies feature much lower levels of wealth inequality than do others. Clearly, humans are able to limit predation in favor of cooperation, and a diverse cottage industry of scholars working in fields such as anti-racism, cooperative economics, and nonviolent communication has grown up to help this transformation occur. This is a point to which we will return toward the end of the essay. Nonetheless, in the world currently, inequality and predation, quote unquote, remain facts of life, and the consequences are clear not just for humans, but the entire biosphere, as we are about to see. Let's turn our attention next to the environmental stage on which the drama of domestication and predation now plays. This whole series, I just finished reading part 2 earlier today. It's brilliant. I highly recommend anybody seeing this to look up the essays and to read through them for themselves, because I think there's so much here. There's so much rich material that deserves further investigation, and it really gives you a lot to think about. I'm glad I'm reading somebody else who's like connected a lot of these dots, and again, being able to identify the patterns, and not only identify the patterns, but also identify sort of the roles and the functions that that each of the components that are found within the pattern. Again, what is the ultimate end game? What does it actually help to facilitate? And this goes back again to what I was saying in the beginning, that it's not necessarily a matter of arguing for the idea of there not being any form of governance at all. The point is, or the question to ask is, who are we being governed by, or who is actually providing the means of governance? Who's occupying that role, and what is the ultimate purpose, or what is the end being served by us kind of engaging in what is really, again, a transaction or a relationship that lies at the heart of that phenomenon. So there's a lot to think about here. I just wanted to read through that first part. The upcoming videos will actually be going through the other 2 parts, which are actually shorter writings than this introductory one. But if you got thoughts of your own, by all means, please offer them. Their comments and below these videos. And again, I want this to be an exchange, not just me babbling or talking to myself. I could just do that by myself, like I've been doing for a long time in my room. So let's get some ideas flying around. But in the meantime, I'm gonna sign off, and we'll see about picking it up. Maybe in the next couple of days. I don't know. I wasn't expected to do this video today, but I was really excited about the about Heinberg's essay. So I wanted to get right on it. So until next time, the hinterlands these days are global. Get away right away.